shut the door there. Okay, good evening, everybody, as well as the web crowd, which I know is all over the world, from New Zealand, no one in Antarctica yet that I know of, but from New Zealand all the way to through the different hemispheres and continents. I welcome you all. So we're talking about circles and squares. Some of you receive, if you don't receive, we send out every Wednesday morning a reminder about the class, the topic and subject matter. So if you want to receive those, just let us know and we'll send you a reminder plus the topic, subject matter. Circles and squares. I like this topic for many reasons, because it gives an opportunity to do a little social satire and laugh at ourselves, which is always a good, I think, a pleasant and lighthearted activity that can loosen the load of life somewhat. So we're going to talk about that. And the reason this week is because in this week's chapter in the Torah, as strange as it may sound to some of you, it's actually there's an entire Kabbalistic, mystical discussion on the issue of squares and circles in connection to once in a entire Bible, the phenomenon where two verses are actually bracketed with these strange-looking brackets that together make up a square. Think of it like two brackets, right? If you combine them, they're a square. So they're two half brackets. And the two verses that are surrounded by these brackets, we actually say it 3 times a week in the prayers. Every time we open up the Ark, the Torah Ark in the synagogue on Shabbat and on Mondays and on Thursdays when the Torah is read. So we say this verse, Vayhi ben Soah ha'aron, Vayomer Moshe, Kuma Hashem v'yafutzu evecha v'yanusu misanecha mepanecha, u'benechei yem eshuva Hashem revovis alfei Yisrael. We say it, I'll translate in a moment, with a song and so on. So next time you're in the synagogue, when they open up the Ark, as soon as they open the Ark, they always say these two verses. And the translation of the verses are, at least in this version, I never like the translations, but loosely translated, goes like this. And it came to pass when the Ark set forward that Moses said, Rise up, God, and let thy enemies be scattered, and let them that hate you flee before you. And it rested, and when it rested, the Ark that is, he said, Return, God, into the 10,000s of the families of Israel. Basically referring to the journey of the Ark that this chapter discusses, that, and I'll just briefly spell out what the Bible says about this, that when the Jews, after they left Egypt, the great exodus from Egypt, and they began their 40-year sojourn and journey, wilderness, in the wandering in the wilderness, so how did they know when to stop and when to go? So the Bible says like this, that there was a cloud of glory, a divine cloud that would rest on the camp, on the entire community, and especially on the Ark. When the cloud would rest, that was a sign that's where they should rest. When the cloud was lifted, it was a sign that we move on. So there were 42 journeys through this wilderness. I've discussed them and their psychological meaning in previous years, and I've written about it as well. So 42 times this cloud rose and settled and rested during this journey, during these 40 years of their journey. So basically what he's referring to is that when the Ark would rest and the Ark would move, because the Ark was what led the journey, that when the cloud would lift, what happened would be the cloud would lift from the Ark and from the temple and from the community. And that was a sign they should begin their march, and the march always began with the Ark being first. So today when we open up the Torah Ark, and we take out the Torah scroll and we walk around the synagogue with the people, because the Torah, it's essentially recreating that journey and that they had then. And then you put the Torah down, you rest it, and then when you put it back into the Ark, is symbolic of the resting of the Ark. So basically have the Ark and and the Torah being the journey of the Torah and the Ark. In those days, you have to remember, the Ark too they traveled with. Today we take the Torah scroll out of the Ark, but that Ark then was a portable one that was carried by the Kohanim, the priests. They carried it. It was a portable Ark that they carried all the way from Egypt, well, not really from Egypt, from when they built the temple to the point when they came to the Promised Land. Later, when the temple was built, a permanent temple, not a temporary one, in Jerusalem, then the Holy of Holies had the Ark, that Ark that they traveled with, and that was its permanent fixture until the end of the time of the first temple, when King Solomon realized, not King Solomon, the children of King Solomon realized that the temple was going to be destroyed. What they did was they hid it. Until today, we don't really know where it is. And hence you have films like Raiders of the Lost Ark and others. The search for the Lost Ark is all about this Ark that they're looking for. Some say it's buried deep beneath the Temple Mount. Others say the Vatican stole it and has it somewhere in their mausoleums, but which doesn't really make sense because the Romans never saw the Ark. The Ark was hidden at the end of the first temple, which was destroyed by the Babylonians. So that's just as an aside. So in case you're wondering if you want to make it your life mission to search for this Ark, it's still not been found. Just like Noah's Ark hasn't been found. Even though despite some people's claims, somewhere in the Turkish mountains, and so on. So you see how this Ark still captures the imagination and the mystery of it till this very day in modern film and in people's minds. And it is quite mysterious, even these verses I just read. What exactly is the secret behind this Ark? That's also part of what we'll discuss here this evening, and it's all in the context that I said before, that these two verses are the only ones in the entire Torah that actually are bracketed in two brackets. So here's what a great Kabbalist writes. He actually writes that when you say these two verses before you travel, it will help protect you from any type of danger to befall upon you. Because as this verse is said, that the Ark protected them, as Moses says, may it protect us against all those that want to do evil to us. And he actually says, as a sgula, so to speak, as a good type of, I guess, how do you translate it? I'm not even sure. As a good charm, that if you say these two verses, you'll be protected from evil befalling upon you. And then he goes on to explain the meaning of the brackets in a very mystical way. So let's start with the mystical, and then we'll move it to the psychological and practical, in a sense, relevant to us. What he says is that the two brackets, as they are combined, as I mentioned, becomes a square. He calls it the square of the divine garment, with which God manifests and encloses himself in order to transmit light and energy to us. He calls it a square garment. Those are his words. So if you're familiar somewhat with mystical teachings, I'll explain what this means. There's a verse in the book of Psalms that says, Eita erka salma. He dresses himself, meaning God, light. He dresses himself with a garment made out of light. That's what the verse in the book of Psalms says, which is referring to this garment. So a garment often is a square garment. Could also be a different shape, but in this case it's square. So what exactly is he talking about? So you've heard of the concept, how many of you have heard the concept of the tzimtzum? Okay. You heard it here first or before you come here? Because I talk about it plenty times. Okay. I just want to know if you ever heard of it. To those that didn't hear it, so I'll explain it from scratch. The tzimtzum is a Hebrew word for the word, what literally means contraction or concealment. But it's a very powerful concept because it's something we all do all the time. And it's very critical in our relationships with people and even with ourselves. Just to give an example. If you were to look at the sun without any shields and filters, a bright sun, your eyes would get blinded. Not necessarily permanently, but it could also be permanent. So what we do is we put on shades, sunglasses, or anything somewhat to filter the powerful light. I mean, same thing when you put sunscreen there it's not so much the light, it's the light is the waves, the different waves that can be destructive or damaging to us. The bottom line is, when something is very intense, the only way for us to contain it is through some form of concealment. Tzimtzum is a word for that form of concealment. There are different levels of concealment. Sometimes an intense transmission is so intense that even one concealment isn't enough. You may need many filters. You may need even more than filters. You may need to deflect the light or the transmission and only get a reflection of it, or a reflection of a reflection. So every transmission, as powerful as it may be, the more powerful it is, the more challenging it is to make sure the containers can contain it. So the Kabbalists, the mystics, speak consistently in terms of light and containers, or and keli, energy and container. To use examples in our own personal lives, let's say you're a teacher and you want to convey a message. So you can just let it flow, but if you don't consider who your students are and where they stand, you may present ideas that are overwhelming and not well paced and well measured. A good communicator is not just someone who has good ideas and knows how to and communicates these ideas, but also someone who knows how fast to communicate them and at what pace, to make sure that the container, meaning the student, can absorb it. So if you have a beginner student, you have to go at a slower pace. You still have the full idea in mind, but you need to do it in a much more paced, measured way. So just like the rain, when rain falls on the earth, the Talmud tells the story of a great famine in Israel, and one of the sages went to pray for rain, because rain is so necessary. As he prayed for rain, the rain began to pour down in buckets and flooding the fields. And flooding the fields can be just as destructive as a famine. So he had to pray a second time, a second prayer, to make sure, as he said, Reiv Teva Eni Yechelem L'Kabel, too much good we cannot receive. And the second prayer was, send us the rain in drops, in raindrops, so the earth, the dry, parched earth, can absorb it, drop by drop, and that way it'll nourish and nurture the fields. You see, sometimes a person who hasn't drank for a long time or hasn't eaten a long time, it's not good to gorge yourself. It has to be absorbed properly. So a key thing in communication is not just how much you're giving, but it's how much you're concealing as well. How much you hold back. And like the white space on a page, there's more white space than black space on a page for you to be able to read it. You need to have the pauses, the right pause, the right beat, so to speak, as well as the music. Wherever you turn, any form of transmission requires some tzimtzum. Now, this is used by the mystics to describe how the divine reality, how God, how a higher reality and a higher state of consciousness interacts with our lower state of consciousness. The way the mystics put it is like this. This is the Arizal writing, speaking. That in the beginning, when you say beginning, you mean figuratively, metaphorically, conceptual beginning, before everything began, so to speak. The way they put it is, a divine infinite light consumed all of existence. It filled everything. Problem then is, because it was so intense, there's no room for any type of independent realities like ourselves. The fact that we can sense ourselves as individualistic, each of us with our own individual and personal boundaries, how is that possible? So the Arizal continues that God implemented the great tzimtzum, he calls it, the great concealment, where he concealed his divine intense energy in order to allow room for independent entities to emerge. So basically, this is nothing new only in Kabbalah. All mysticism teaches the same idea, that the place of the great white light, the place of great unity, a place of higher reality, its intensity is such that there's no room for individual creatures like ourselves, for this limited consciousness that we have. If we were able to see behind the doors, beyond the doors of perception, as William Blake writes, we would be completely destroyed. This is why people who have traveled there, so to speak, in one way or another, often cannot return easily. Because when you're blinded and overwhelmed by something much greater, it can drive you insane. Because you don't have the containers to contain it. You can literally burn out from the experience. And this is true whether it's induced by foreign substances, or it's a healthy induced type of spiritual awakening. Any type of awareness always has the risk of overwhelming the person who's becoming aware. That's why there has to be great care has to be taken when you teach people how to access so-called deeper truths and deeper realities. This is also true psychologically. The fact that we are in denial about things, and all of us have measures of denial. So we always talk about the negative sides of denial. You know, you're in denial, your blind spots, blind. But there's also a positive side to denial. When something is too overwhelming for us psychologically, the human being goes into a state of denial. It just makes it easier to absorb the blow. When denial becomes unhealthy is when you maintain a state of denial forever, and you can never get back to an honest place. But all of us go into some form of denial, God forbid, when there's a very shocking, traumatic experience. If we didn't, we would absolutely die from the shock. Shock is almost like that it's unbelievable, and your body and soul and spirit and psyche go into a state of not being able to accept it. At that stage, it's actually healthy. When it's not healthy, that's why in early intervention in any post-traumatic syndrome, what you want to do is allow the shock, but then at some point, the person has to re-enter reality at their own pace. The wisdom and the sensitivity that's required is knowing how fast that should take place, but not to force anything. So the human body has its own ways of responding to difficult situations, which sometimes forces us to go into some form of denial or concealment, or almost lack of awareness. Because if we were, we would not be able to tolerate it. So the idea is, essentially from this context that I've discussed, I think, last class, 2 weeks ago, was that really sanity and our sense of consciousness, you can say, is really limited perception. It's almost like the insane are closer to reality than the sane. I know that sounds weird, but that's, in a sense, think of it this way. When the floodgates of consciousness open up and you have no way to temper it, it overwhelms a person. That's why madness and genius are very close relatives. Very thin line between madness and genius. Because it's like a flow that's coming too fast. So for a genius, it's just enough not to drive him completely insane. And for someone who goes over a bit and there aren't floodgates to control the flow, it overwhelms. So if our unconscious would suddenly open up right now, and everything would come pouring out, we would not be able to survive. So it's healthy that we have chemicals and different hormones and even genetic structures that allow ideas or experiences to flow in at their own particular pace. And we have compartments, very painful experiences. With time, the blow becomes blunted somewhat. We're able to put it into a closet, into a compartment inside of our psyches, which allows us to survive and allows us to move on. So the idea of when we say we're aware, actually what we're consciously aware of is really mostly concealed. In other words, awareness is really a state of concealment. And the more that is revealed to us, the more we better have containers and ability to be able to absorb it. So to go back to, without elaborating to our discussion here, this tzimtzum is usually seen in terms of a circle. The way the Arizal puts it is that the divine light withdrew, not physically but conceptually, into a state like a circle, leaving a space. Think of it like the hole of a donut. And in this so-called empty space, the truth is it's not empty, but in this space where there is a vacuum, and the light is not consciously sensed, we have is the place where existence comes into play. So, with that being said, the question then asked is, so what then is the square garment? So let me explain what the Arizal says. It's a very vital point. And then we'll bring it back to our personal lives. I don't want to remain only on the esoteric dimension here. So this is what the Arizal says. He says, why does it have to be like a circle? He explains. Having a problem? Huh? Why does it have to be like a circle? So he says because if it's not like a circle, there wouldn't be an equanimity, an equal level of access from everything within the sphere to the light around the sphere. So let me explain what that means again with an example. So a teacher, let's say, think of a teacher that's infinitely more brilliant than the students. Though that's not possible because we're all human beings, so it's not infinite, it's finite. But just for a moment, think of it very distant, apart from the level of the students. So what the teacher does is, as I said earlier, contracts, withdraws, or we could say conceals the brain, the intelligence. So when a teacher is conveying an idea, the teacher has a lot more than what the student, a lot more in their mind than what the student is hearing. The student is only hearing piecemeal, piece by piece by piece. Within it lies all the wisdom and intelligence and brilliance of the teacher, but most of it is concealed. The teacher, from the teacher's perspective, it's all there because he knows what he's doing. He or she knows what he's doing. So the way the teacher conceals this light, if it was done in a jagged way, like in a square fashion, this is what the Rizal says, it would not be equal to all the students, in a sense. So he does it in a circular fashion, which means that all the students are equally distant from that infinite, brilliant light. So it's the circle that creates a certain equality, where we all begin on a level place, all equally distant from that infinite light. So the question that's asked then is, how is that consistent with this, what I mentioned earlier, the square garment? So to explain this in a more palatable way, let me bring it back to us practically. So Webster translates a square as being someone that is very conservative, not risk-taking, and stuff like that. When usually in our modern lingo, when we use the word square, it's usually used in a derogatory way. Look how square that person is. He's a square, she's a square. Meaning that they don't think out of the box, not spontaneous. All that comes with the concept of being square. You know what I'm talking about? Okay. Now, I don't know how many people would actually identify themselves as being square in our society, because it's not considered to be necessarily a compliment. But what's the opposite of a square is a circle. So a circle, on the other hand, is considered to be more of a symbol of spontaneity, excitement, ability to get out of your mold or patterns or routines. So let's speak in terms of relationships. Who would you prefer to have a relationship with? A square or a circle? So of course our answer would be you want the best of both worlds. Because a square on one hand is very reliable and consistent, like let's call it like a clerk. But there's no excitement, there's no spontaneity, which makes it very monotonous. On the other hand, a person who's more like a circle type of soul, a circular soul, will give you a lot of excitement and spontaneity and flexibility and surprises, but often comes with a price that they're not very grounded and reliable. A time is not a time, schedule is not a schedule. And sometimes you think they seem to be mutually exclusive. It's hard to find someone that really has mastered both sides of it, that is both very precise and very accurate and very accountable, at the same time also extremely exciting to be with and very spontaneous. They often come, as I said, one at the expense of the next. So in personality types, they both have some powerful strengths. Sometimes we compare the two to the sun and the moon. The sun is very consistent. The moon is constantly changing. So again, which is a preferable type of relationship? Relationship is a good way to put it, because it's one thing, you want to have fun with somebody, no commitment. A circle is always more fun. But a relationship also, you want to also have commitment. You don't want to know that a person can't stay around for too long. So as one person told me, not cynically, they actually meant it, he told me, I have two girlfriends. One is a circle, one is a square. And that's how he deals with it. The girlfriends don't know about each other, so that's another story. So the question on a psychological level, obviously, about ourselves as well is, however you identify yourself, and I'm sure everybody here has their so-called level of self-awareness. I'm not getting into whether it's a correct and accurate awareness or not, but the fact is, who are we, each of us? Are we born one way or another? Do we have any control over this? Is there something you can do about it? Because usually we think in terms of square. A person's a square, you think that's it, that's their destiny. They're stuck. They're born that way. Usually it runs in families and stuff like that, so it's hereditary, and nothing you can really do about it. Whereas the circular soul is also something that is just inbred, and not much you can do about it. So as far as distant this may sound from what I was discussing from the mystical, you'll soon see it's quite connected. Very much connected. Because in the Bible too, in the Torah too, as you see here with these brackets, there's discussion about these two elements here. And the interesting thing that we're going to elaborate upon is that both exist in the soul. Just like in the cosmic level, there's a tzimtzum, there's a concealment or a garment that's circular, there's also a garment that's square. So too in our soul, we also have a square and a circle. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with geometry and geometrical patterns, but you have the concept of a circle within a square and a square within a circle. You see this different type of imagery. This imagery actually originates in Kabbalistic thought. There's that concept on a cosmic level and on a personal level. So the fact is the soul, which is really a reflection of the divine, because we say the human soul is the flame of God. We say that we're created in the image of God. So the true question is, what is reality? Which one is God? Is God a square or a circle? So most people who have had religious experiences will say God is definitely a square. Look how angry he gets in the Bible. He doesn't have any sense of humor. And everything is very rigid and very fundamentalist. And religion in general, very few people are going to identify it with a circular dimension. We identify religion very much with square because it's all about rules and guidelines and reward and punishment. The perception of religion is as square as it gets. In truth, however, this is a profound stereotype that has very little to do with reality. I agree with you. I would agree and say that bureaucracies, including religious bureaucracies, are by definition square and structured and don't seem to have that type of playfulness and soulful spirit. But in truth, anyone that is a student of mysticism, a student of spiritual teachings, especially spirituality, Jewish spirituality, you come to recognize that the true pioneers and revolutionaries in the Bible were all very circular. They weren't square at all. If Abraham was a square, we wouldn't be here today. He grew up in a pagan society, and there were very strong guidelines and a very big demand and peer pressure for conformity. So if he was a square, he would have been a conformist. And instead, he went on to spawn and give birth to what we could say the father of all faiths, of all religions. The Torah puts it, Av HaMoin Goyim, that Abraham is the father of all nations. All the major religions came out of it. Abraham was an absolute bohemian, if you want to put it that way, in the sense of a free spirit, challenging the norms and the structures that existed. As it was with all pioneers and great thinkers and great revolutionaries throughout history. Einstein was not born in a vacuum. He had very strong Abraham genes inside of him. So he may have been a postal clerk, but because he was able to think out of the box and think differently, he was able to come up with concepts and ideas that absolutely were breathtaking and completely shattered previous axioms and givens. And the same is with anyone that's broken through any type of innovation, invention, anything. Always begins with somebody that is not thinking with the previous guidelines and rules. So if Abraham and Moses and all these great revolutionaries who gave birth to the ideas that we find in the Bible and the Torah were so circular, when did religion exactly become square? That's the big question. And more importantly, what we see from that is that when you unleash the soul, it is very, very much more circular than it is a square. So to really get down to the bottom of it, the real question is, what are these two forms of energy? And what roles do they play? Obviously, as I said earlier, each of them have their strengths and weaknesses. But what I'm going to explain right now, what I'm going to address now, is that in fact we all have both elements inside our souls. And both are necessary, and they both balance each other. And when you really understand it well, you can have both, the best of both worlds. That's the bottom line. And it's not etched in stone. Remember, if it's etched in stone, that again is square type of thinking. From a circular point of view, nothing is etched in stone. Even the fact that even the fact that a circle must be a circle, because then the circle becomes a square, and thinking I could only be a circle. I can't try anything new. The whole idea of true free spiritedness is that you could always try something new. So let me introduce this statement from the Avodah called Ibn Gabbai, a great mystic of the early Middle Ages. He says the following: that he asked the question, does God have the power to manifest in the finite? That God can manifest in the infinite, that's obvious. And his answer is absolutely. And this is the way he puts it. He says, because if you were to say that God can manifest only in the infinite and not in the finite, that too would make God finite and limit God that he can only be in one and not in the other. Because the definition of finite is not that it's finite and not infinite. It's that it's this and not that. As soon as you put something in a box and identify by a particular shape, even the name infinity, that too is limiting. And therefore he goes on and says, that's why it's critical to understand that the same God that created the infinite light is the same God that also created the finite containers. And both are divine emanations. So to go back to the analogy I gave earlier, let's say you're giving a class, you're teaching, or you want to transmit any other energy, love. And I mentioned earlier, any transmission requires two things: what you give and what you don't give. What you give and what you withhold, at least for that moment. You know, if you speak too fast, the person won't understand you. So it's not just the words you say, it's also the pacing, to make sure that what you say is paced properly. You share ideas, you pause and allow a person to absorb the ideas. So it's not just what you give, it's also what pace you give. It's not just the gas, but also the brakes, basically. Both are transmissions coming from you. Both are strengths within you. So usually we think in terms like this: to give off light, transmit light, takes more strength than to withhold light. But think again, it's not correct. To withhold is always more difficult than to give. Because when somebody, for instance, a wise person has something to say, it's easy for them to say it. It takes a lot more energy to withhold something that's on the tip of your tongue than to say it. When you go to someone for wise counsel, it's not only what they say, it's sometimes what they don't say that can teach you more than even what they say. That's, of course, their judgment to determine when and what the person should hear. Sometimes they feel a person is not ready to hear something. Or it may even be that the person hearing it won't be able to do anything with it, so why say it? So it's not just what wise people tell you, it's also what they don't tell you. And it's not because they're holding a secret or something, it's because it's not necessary at that moment. They don't think in terms of how to try to show off how brilliant they are. They're interested in helping the person. When you want to help somebody, you think of what's good for the person, not what's good for you. Not what's good for the one that's giving, it's what's good for the one that's receiving. This is the rule in all true transmission. In love, in education, in any real experience. Parents that give to their children based on their own terms ultimately will hurt their children. In love, you find this very often. People have a lot of love to give. And often you can what's the word I want to say? Smother somebody with your love with good intentions. You want to give love. And you say, hey, I have so much love to give. Like, instead of withholding, I'm giving. But you end up smothering them because it's on your terms and not on their terms. So every form of giving requires also a form of concealment, and that concealment is also part of giving, by the way. It's another gift you're giving that person. It's just coming from a different source. So both are necessary. To go back to the square and the circle thing, we live in a world of structure. The sun rises every morning a certain way. Whether it's the world of mineral, the vegetable, the animal, or human, everything has its rules. You could say the nature of this universe is as square as it gets. It is predictable to the point of monotony, but it's necessary. That's the universe in which we live. On the other hand, as I said earlier, every human being, every one of us knows that monotony is one of the most destructive forces, and we look for that rush of excitement, that high, that novelty, on all levels. So how do we reconcile these two? So let's look, for example, at a tree. A tree is an example. A tree, on one hand, has a very powerful foundation. A strong tree has a tree trunk with roots that dig deep into the ground, deeply rooted. And this is what both allows the tree to stand properly and also to nourish itself, because the roots reach for and find moisture, water, and that's what feeds the tree. At the same time, look at the other side of the tree. As it grows upward, it grows outward. You can't really predict how it's going to grow. It branches off, branches into other branches. Branches have flowers, leaves, fruits, depending on what kind of tree it is. And there, the tree has almost like an infinite amount of growth and potential, to the point that it will also release seeds that will give birth to another tree, ad infinitum. So you see here literally a paradox. On one hand, there's a very solid, unwavering structure. On the other hand, it's growing outward in all kinds of beautiful ways. So is this, would you call this a square or a circular type of reality? The answer is it's both. And the interesting thing is not only that it's both, but they're interdependent. Meaning, not to sound too poetic, that a tree with deep roots will bear beautiful fruits. Eliminate the roots, and it will compromise the entire tree ultimately. So it's not just a tree, as they say, a tree is the only thing that grows in two directions. It's not only the tree growing upward, it's also growing downward. In our own lives, let's for a moment think, and this is not, unfortunately this is not just a mental exercise, an imaginary one, but it's a real reality for many people today. You grow up in a home where there's no stability, no consistency, and you don't know where love is coming from, or the people that are supposed to love you disappear or abandon you, or whatever it is, or deeper forms of abuse. What kind of psychological impact does that have on a person? It's the equivalent of a tree that is not grounded, that does not have roots. Or let's put it this way, it's been severed from its roots to some extent. In our early lives, consistency and consistent love is not just an option, it's absolutely necessary for the well-being and the welfare of a soul to come to its own, grow into its own. Stunt the early growth in that level, and the free-spiritedness of the soul will always be compromised. So the interesting paradox is this. The more secure, the more square you can say, and reliable was the love that you received in early stages of your life, the more free you will be to experiment and soar the rest of your life. So you could even say the circle is dependent completely on the square. Now we usually don't think in these terms because we think the immediate. You know, right now this person is fun, this person is a square. That's very good, that's very interesting. That's in the moment that may be true. But in the big picture of things, if you think of anything that truly develops properly, you'll see you need both elements all the time. A bird flies. And I just read, I think in the Times this week, they had about migrating birds. Like 7,500 miles they fly without stopping, non-stop. Can you imagine a little bird like that? That means no eating. You know, that's pretty amazing. No fuel. What's the longest airplane flight? Non-stop. I think the longest was from New York to Singapore or something like that. Huh? Right. So what is that? 4,000 miles? It doesn't matter. Maybe. Okay. The point being, it doesn't matter. I'm not trying to compare airplanes to birds, but on an airplane we have airplane food, and we have. I'm not getting into the quality of the food for that. But going back to this, so a bird flies, a bird soars. It's been a great metaphor for human beings. We want to fly. in many ways, and we look at a bird as the soaring spirit. But interestingly, a bird begins not flying; it begins in a nest, where it's grounded and it can't even fly. It's early stages. Each bird, depending on the time, is completely dependent on the food that its mother or father brings it, and it needs the nest, and it needs the nurturing in the nest. Just an example for each of us. To build the confidence to fly and to really be a true nonconformist requires that somebody was a very big conformist in taking care of us. Let's put it that way. I don't want to use the word conformist. It's not that they conformed to take care of us, but I meant to say they were very consistent in doing so. And they were not flying around. Imagine if birds would say, listen, I'm a free spirit. I have no time for my children to bring them food. So the next generation of birds will be gone. So the same bird that flies also knows when it has to come and feed its young. So the interesting paradox is they're interdependent, which is why the Kabbalists make a big fuss about the square and the circle and the circle and the square on a cosmic level, because both are necessary. The circle is obviously the free spirit part, but it requires a certain form of structure. I'll just give a few more examples just to drive the point home. You have music. So music is obviously our modern symbol for free-spiritedness. Soul, it's called. And in many ways in our generation, music has captivated the young, which is a phenomenon, is a unprecedented phenomenon. Music was not that way, even in the good old days of the classics. Classic masters and music was around. It wasn't something that just captured the young. It wasn't that way at all. Now you could say, okay, then there wasn't the distribution, there were no LPs, there were no CDs, and today, and MP3s, and all the whole iTunes that we have today. But nevertheless, music was played. It was played in orchestras, and plays, and operas, and so on and so forth. I have my own little theory about this, based on the following parable that I often cite, that when God created the world, he asked the angels, he consulted with the angels, which is what God always did, but he never listened, which is, I guess, what we do with all our consultants. You pay them, and then you don't listen. And he asked them, should I give the human race music, art? And the angels immediately, as they usually did, said absolutely no. The human race are an inferior race. They will abuse it. They'll commercialize it. They'll turn it into their own selfish thing. Leave music and art in our domain, and we will sing your praises. Which is what the angels always said about the human race. I guess God used them as some type of sounding boards to know what not to do, maybe. And God said, no, I will give them music because I want them to have something to remember me by. So it's hard to imagine, but think of a world without song and without music. I don't just mean musicians creating music. I mean no music in your heart and soul. Music didn't touch you. It would be a language we didn't understand. And we know today that music is a very natural language. It's not an education. It's not one you acquire. It's from birth. Even fetuses in their mother's womb have been witnessed responding to song. So the question is, where do they learn this song from? What is it about song, this language that a soul understands, even before any education, even before emerging into this earth? So the mystics put it this way. They say song is the language of the soul. It's soul journey, soul travel is through a song. That's a soul cannot move from one place to another without a song. Bodies have vehicles with which we move. We have our legs. We have vehicles we've created, bicycles, motorcycles, automobiles, ships, airplanes, the list goes on. There are many vehicles that we use. But how does the soul move from here to there? And the answer is with a song. In the temple, there were actually 15 steps. That you could not climb those steps unless you sang a song. So we have in the book of Psalms what's called the 15 Shir HaMailas, which means the song of the ascents, the song of the steps. The songs composed by the Levites in the temple in order to climb. Because you really cannot lift a soul without a song. So why you may ask the question, why is it that you can hear words and that can be inspiring and that lift your spirit even without a song? Because the person saying them is actually singing. It may not sound like a song, but it's a song that's being communicated. So song has the power to lift the spirit. The only language that can lift the spirit. If you speak with the power of a song, it has the same ability. That's why if someone's trying to sell you something, they're not going to get your soul inspired. They may manipulate your emotions. They may get you to think that you have to buy this because it's important for you. But a soul to soar requires a song. So song is the language of the soul. It's a spiritual force. And the soul understands it. Souls relate only to songs. They don't hear speeches. In heaven, there are no speeches. Everything is done through songs. You can't sing, no one's going to come to listen. That's how it is. So, in that sense, song is a very spiritual thing. And here's my theory. Yeah, you can take it or leave it. But you heard it here first. Let's put it this way. Maybe not. Maybe you heard it before. I don't know. Religion has become so corrupt. And you know my weekly diatribe against religion, so I'm not to go through it all. And has become so bureaucratized and so non-spiritual that there's a deep hunger in our times for something soulful, transcendent. And since religion doesn't do it, as many other so-called systems don't do it, what has happened is that we have replaced it with music. A concert has become a cathedral, and song has become a prayer. It may not be quite the same shape and form as religious rituals, but it is what religion was always meant to be. That's what Abraham taught. He taught people to sing. He taught souls to soar. And that's what the Torah always was meant to be. As a matter of fact, it says that the whole Torah is a song. The problem is we can't hear the song any longer because our ears are limited and the words are being said in a very dry and empty way. But it's all a song. And if you read it and hear it properly, it's all about helping a spirit fly and soar to greater places. So music fundamentally is, you can say, the most circular of all things. That's why actually in Hasidic thought, a song is compared to a circle. Where does a song begin and where does it end? It really has no beginning and end. I mean, you can begin it. I mean, a song has a beginning and end. But technically, you can keep going like a circle. It doesn't really come to an end until you decide to shut it down or the singer decides to stop singing. A song, the beginning and end can continue endlessly, like a circle. Square as a structure with sharp angles and corners and very clear definition. So look at song and tell me, is it only circular or does it have a square element to it? It has a very square element to it. It has absolute structure. A song, there's only that many musical notes on the musical scale. You can never create a new musical note because that sound has its sound that we can hear with our ears has its parameters. Parameters is square by definition. And yet, somebody can take a music sheet or play by ear, and with all the structure, can play something that is absolutely magical, angelic, that can lift you to a place that's far beyond any structure. Just like the metaphor I gave earlier with the tree, or with the child and the bird, that we all need structure in order to be able to transcend structure, is exactly the whole message of what music and what squares and circles are all about. So the idea, and I've seen this, many of us have rebelled against square structures by becoming so circular and completely almost compromising anything that's square-like. And for good reason. When you've been hurt or you don't see the merits, you go to the other extreme. I know people who've also gone the other way around. They've been such free spirits, their parents were so free-spirited, that it hurt them when they were children, so they decided they're going to live a very structured life and don't let their spirit free. And they build very structured life. Their control becomes their game, control game. Wherever you see too much control or too much so-called freedom, rest assured there's a problem. I know people who are look like real free spirits. They're everywhere. You give them a challenge, they're there. No taboos. But if you really dig deep, you'll see they're running for their lives. They're not free spirits. They're afraid to stay somewhere for too long. Because a true free spirit doesn't have fear. And fearlessness also includes being able to be committed. As I said before, if God can only be infinite and not finite, there's something missing. If a free spirit could only fly and can never stay in one place for too long, you have to wonder why. So you have people, when you say freedom, freedom we often translate as being, I can do whatever I like. I have all the options. In the Middle Ages, when we're living in a feudal system or under monarchs and despots and so on, we were not free. Today we live in democracy, we're free. I don't know about you, but that is a very, very superficial and actually distorted definition of freedom. Yet technically, freedom is the difference between someone in prison, they can't get out of a prison cell, and someone who's not in prison, one is free, one is not free. I understand that technical difference. But there's something else to be defined as freedom. There are people that can be running around and have the most millions of frequent flyer miles, and they're not necessarily great travelers. They just know how to travel on planes. Their souls never move. They're stuck. You cannot see them being flexible. You don't see them ever experimenting with something, psychologically new or free. You could have, as I said, free spirits who never leave their hat in the same place, but they're not necessarily free. They're running for their lives. When a person grew up in a burning building and they don't trust any buildings, they're never going to stay in a building for too long. Is that a free person or a trapped person? It looks free. It's all over the place, but it doesn't mean it's free. It means it's fear. It's running out of fear. And then there's the people that I personally witnessed. A chassid sitting under a talus, which is a prayer shawl, synagogue on a Shabbat, for 6 hours, without budging, without moving. So you think he's asleep, or he's just paralyzed. No, he's soaring to the greatest heights, but he doesn't have to move because his soul is moving. Movement is not about necessarily physical movement. You could be sitting in one place and soar to the greatest spiritual heights and be the most transcendent creature. And you could be flying around everywhere and be completely trapped. So how I would define freedom would be as follows. Freedom is the true you expressing itself without any other force imposing itself upon you. That's the definition of freedom. And in that context, it's your choice. If you choose to commit and to remain in a certain place for the rest of your life, but it's coming not by someone imposing it upon you, or because of peer pressure or some other force, that is a free act. The fact that you chose to be committed, the fact that you chose to be, let's put it this way, square, is still circular because it's coming from the circle, it's not coming from the square. And vice versa. A true square, a true structure, is not afraid of movement and soaring and freedom. It's not only not afraid of it, it is the roots. As I said, it's the seeds and the nourishment that allows someone to have the confidence to truly fly in the greatest places. So all this are the statements about the subject. The question, of course, always is how do we implement this? It really comes down to how do you really get beyond your fear? Whether it's your fear of commitment or it's your fear of the opposite, of experimenting or soaring. Some people need structure. It's what gives them sanity because they didn't have structure in their lives. So they become very adamant, I must have structure. And we have to respect that because sometimes that is a lifesaver. The idea that everything was everything and there was no schedules and no times and everything was never, you couldn't, unexpected, not always a healthy thing for a child especially. And then some of us, the other way around, we're afraid of getting out of, that person's afraid of getting out of structure because they were hurt by it. And then there's the opposite. Someone is afraid to connect any structure because structure traps you. So it all does come down to, even though I don't want to simplify it into fear, but it comes down to what has shaped us in our lives. Why are we who we are? Why are we running? Or why are we not running? Why do we commit or why don't we commit? Or why do we not commit, rather? So this already is a more complicated subject. When I say more complicated, I really should rephrase it. I don't mean more complicated, we're talking about it. I meant less generic. This is already unique to each of us, because no two of us are in the same place. So I'll just review several general principles that I think can apply to most of us. And this takes me back to this verse here. It says, Eilecha ben cherin elamisha esek b'teira. This is a statement in the Pirkei Avos, which means you don't have a free person unless someone who exerts themselves in Torah. It doesn't say someone that exerts or studies Torah is free, but it says you don't have someone that's free unless they connect to Torah. What is the meaning of that? And why is Torah so relevant? And you'll see the connection here to these two verses. And I have to preface by stating the stereotype of religion yet again. The problem in addressing Torah or anything that has Jewish implications is always because it's fraught with stereotypes. Every one of us has been in some way impacted by the current state of religion in general and attitudes to it, either through our own upbringing or through confirming it through some modern media, a Woody Allen movie or something like that. And much of those stereotypes actually are quite justified, legitimate, but they're still a stereotype. It means they don't reflect the reality. Now, why are they justified? Because they actually reflect the existing reality. You know, all those jokes about irrelevant rabbis and about Judaism not being hip are very accurate because you go into most synagogues, and I say most, I'm not pointing any fingers, you have a waning population, you have young people not coming, and in this capitalistic system, we say the customer is always right. So even though you'll have some rabbis and rebbitzins bemoaning the fact that the young people simply are not committed today, I would say that maybe you're not telling them anything that they intrigues them to come. Maybe you should point the finger at yourself instead at the people who are not coming. And when they do come Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, all they hear is how come they don't come the rest of the year. And then most people identify with synagogues and religion as fundraising entities, for administration and appeals and so on. Everyone understands that a synagogue needs to survive, but if it's only about appeals and fundraising, you don't feel your soul nurtured there, why in the first place should you support the place, except out of guilt or think you buy a ticket to God or something, or your parents out of nostalgia. So we have ourselves a fundamental problem, and I can go on and on and on. I'm quite aware of this, and which is why I have fundamental problems with anyone that calls me religious, or a rabbi for that matter, because I know what those terms are associated with. To me, religion and God, rabbis, synagogues, is absolutely nothing that you just heard. It's all about one thing and one thing only, a spiritual journey. It's about the soul. A rabbi is supposed to be a soul doctor, not a fundraiser, not an administrator. He's a soul doctor. A person who understands souls, relates to souls, helps us soar, is a soaring soul himself or herself. Torah is a blueprint for a soul to travel. All the guidelines and the mitzvahs and the structure of Torah are only meant to be, as I said before, with the structure of music. You need structure to transcend structure. That's how it works. You need, we live in a structured universe, and therefore we need certain guidelines, certain mechanics that help us reach a place that's beyond the mechanical. The problem is when the mechanical becomes dogma, that's all you have, ritual, dogma. And people trying to enforce that upon, and then impose it upon us. That's what most people's experience with religion is. So they don't want to have anything to do with that. They're not interested in someone's imposing dogma upon them, especially if it's condescending. Or it gets so watered down that then it loses, maybe not be imposing dogma, but then it doesn't have any spirit either. So then what is it? It's an empty, hollow ritual. Again, I'm not going to go through the whole spectrum of religious experiences today. You know it on your own. I just want to make sure that you understand where I'm coming from. So to me, the whole thing comes from a completely different place. Moses and Abraham, if they were here today, they wouldn't recognize the synagogues that we go to. They may recognize them mechanically, technically speaking. So when it says you cannot be a free person unless you study Torah, we're not talking about somebody who's just reading Torah every day diligently. That may be beautiful. But if it does not have that free-spirited element to it, the spirit of Torah, they're not necessarily being free. That's why I said it doesn't say anyone who studies Torah is free. So it's the other way around. So how do you explain the statement freedom? The answer is very simple. Why do you need music to help you soar? Why can't you just soar on your own? Because the fact is we live in a very harsh material world. We're burdened by the stress, the strain, and anxieties of life. And you need sometimes someone to throw you a rope to help you out of the rut. Music is a tool. That's why God said, I'm giving you a gift to help you remember me. It's a tool. It's like a gift given to you. And when you'll be in a situation where you're stuck, here's a song, here's a voice that can help you reach to a greater place. Love is the same thing. And Torah is the same thing. They tell the story of that fellow, two people were traveling in a Russian town. They came to a city. It was very cold Russia, and Russian winters are very, very cold. And they came for Shabbos, and they wanted to go to the mikveh. It's a custom by Hasidim to go to the mikveh before Shabbos, a ritual bath. And they asked around, where's the mikveh? They said, well, in the winter, nobody really goes to the mikveh because it's situated in the bottom of a hill. It's a very slippery hill. And very difficult to get there in the winter. They said, no one in this entire town goes to the mikveh on Shabbos. They couldn't believe that. They said, yes, there is one elderly gentleman in his 80s. He goes. How does he make it? Well, they smiled. They said, he's a special person. He knows how to make it. So they were skeptical. So they said, they decided they're going to follow him. So they followed him this Friday afternoon, particularly cold, snowy afternoon. And yes, they come to the mountain. They see him. They come to the hill. And they both slipping and sliding and breaking their feet and whatever it was. And he walked down the mountain without a problem, went to the mikveh, came back. They came to shul, half, this one in crutches, this one in a limp. And they go over to him and they say, can you explain to us how you were able to maneuver the slippery slopes? We're two young guys, we couldn't make it. And he answered in Yiddish, he said, when you're tied above, you don't fall below. That's what he answered. That when you're tied above, you don't fall below. Now, obviously, he meant spiritually speaking. When you're connected to something above yourself, it doesn't let you slip down below. This is the rule of all greatness. It's obviously connected to humility. It's connecting like the midget that stands on the shoulders of a giant. When the Mishnah is saying, that you cannot really be free in this world unless you connect to a wisdom and to a blueprint that's greater than yourself. The Torah's guidelines were not meant to limit us. They're meant to help us fly. But you cannot fly with your own tools. Left to your own resources, you'll just stay grounded. The Torah, like music, are tools that help you fly. I told this story many times, but it captures the point very well here. Talk about circles and squares. I was in Santa Cruz, California, quite a number of years ago, around maybe 12 years ago. It was after my book was published, Toward a Meaning for Life. And I spoke there at a New Age bookstore called Gateways. I don't know if it's still around there, but if you've ever been to Santa Cruz, a very interesting town. It's around an hour south from San Francisco. And it's situated between the mountains and the water, the Pacific. It has its own particular climate, very beautiful place, very, you can say, very sublime, very spiritual environment. And you see people there very relaxed and very soulful, very antithetical, you can say, to New York. Being a hardcore New Yorker, it was quite interesting, the contrast. Like there, nobody seems to have a job, and nobody's definitely rushing anywhere. And I saw a bunch of young people milling about. I thought they were waiting for a movie or something. And now they told me they're just in bliss. Someone said to me, they're in bliss. There was an expression like that once. They were in bliss. Anyway, I spoke at this bookstore, and it was I remember it very vividly because, firstly, the environment, as I said, was very conducive. Didn't have to go into any long debates and introductions about souls and God. At the end of my talk, a woman got up and asked the following question. She said, I grew up, she said, as a child, I grew up in Borough Park, Brooklyn, a bastion of, let's call it, very square Jews. if that's the right word to use. And she said, I went to Beis Yaakov, it's a very ultra-Orthodox school, and I never heard anything like anything close to what you're saying here this evening. The Judaism I was taught was all about anger and fear and guilt and punishment and an angry God, wrathful God, demanding. She said, my parents were angry people. Whenever I tried to ask questions about anything I was searching for, I was told to just shut up and just be a good Yiddish Meidele, good Jewish girl, and like your mother and grandmother, and you don't ask questions. And she said at some point my soul was asphyxiated. At 17 I had to run, and I ran. Never returned. I'm sure my parents have sat shiva for me, have mourned for me. I went to California, LA, then ended up in Haight-Ashbury, in San Francisco, those years, and then finally settled here in Santa Cruz. I discovered God, but not in Beis Yaakov. I discovered God through LSD and through Zen Buddhism, the way she put it. Which, of course, I've heard the story many, many times, different variations. So you're standing here, you look like those rabbis that I went to school with, and you talk about God and soul in such a warm, personal way. It's not nothing in Judaism I ever learned is close to that. Where did you get this from? So I saw a lot of people's eyes opened up. They all were very interesting to hear what I'm going to say. I said, well, let's put it this way. We Jews have this thing called a 613-step program. So she smiled and she said, okay, I understand. Afterwards, we had this intense conversation. Not just her, a few people stayed around very late into the night. One of those, existential discussions. And I told her the following analogy that I once heard. That when God created the nightingale, the bird, with a beautiful voice, the nightingale came and thanked God. I said, thank you very much for the beautiful voice you gave me. And at times I stand perched on a branch in the dusk and serenade, and everyone in the forest is mesmerized by my music, by my song. However, one problem. I have nothing to protect myself from predators. I'm a vulnerable little bird in a harsh world. And sometimes someone looking for a good dinner will be attracted by my voice, and without thinking much, will just gobble me up for dinner. You need to give me, God, something to protect myself from predators, from my enemies. So God offered the bird a beak, a sharp beak, and the bird looked at the beak, inspected the merchandise, and said to God, no. An ugly nose like that for a beautiful bird like me. No. So then God offered the bird claws, a set of claws, sharp claws, to protect itself with. And the bird again rejected the claws, unbecoming, so unelegant. So finally, at this point, God said to the bird, okay, I'm going to give you wings, a set of wings. The bird looked at the wings, never seeing wings before. The bird said, I don't understand you, the master of the universe. You created the whole universe with such beautiful design and such symmetry. I have enough body weight and flesh to carry with me. You give me 2 extra pieces of flesh, which will only weigh me further down and make it more difficult to run from a predator. So God, of course, said, no, little bird. What I'm giving you are called wings. And wings, when you learn to use them, will help you fly. They'll let you fly to places you can never reach on your own. So you can fly away should there ever be an enemy. That's God's response. So I told this woman in Santa Cruz, I said, look, I'm not judging you, and I'll never judge you. I don't know if I would have been done different than you if I was asphyxiated, and I was taught and imposed upon me these dogmatic rituals without any soulful experience. But I have to tell you that what you rejected was, maybe for good reason, but you only rejected half the story. They never told you the other half. They told you about the body weight They never told you about the wings. The mitzvahs in the Torah, there's no question, are obligations, and if you look at them just at face value, well, who needs them? They regulate everything. How you eat, what you eat, when you eat, sleep, love, sexuality, birth, from birth to death, everything, from morning to night. There's nothing the Torah doesn't address. And if you really look at every detail, it's such regulation that it's absolutely obsessive. However, there's another side to it. These are also wings, that if you learn to use them like musical notes, they help you fly to places you can never reach on your own. And that was never taught to you, and I would say not taught to this generation altogether. It wasn't taught to me either, to be honest. I had to find it on my own. But I found it, and it's there. It's not a modern creation. It's there in the books, published and written, and you can see it, and it's thousands of years old. This is the true Torah, really. This is the inner Torah, it's called. Pnimis Torah, the soul of Torah. And it is vital to soar. That is critical. Do the rules and regulations play a role? Of course they play a role. Just like musical notes play a role. Just like the mechanics of any system plays a role. There's mechanics in physics and technology, and every computer or gadget we have, there's mechanics. But what is a gadget? The mechanics are just pressing the buttons that trigger and generate other forces at work that are not visible. So we have today divorced. There's a divorce between the mechanics of Judaism and the soul of it. You'll find the more religious people are, the less spiritual they are. And often the more spiritual, less religious. For these reasons, because this connection, the fusion between the two is not there. And this is true not just for religion and spirituality, ritual and spiritual. It's true, as I said before, with personalities, the square personality, the circular personality. And it's also true even in the sciences and in philosophies. Western philosophy, for instance, is very square-oriented, very linear compared to Eastern philosophy. The yin and the yang, or the right brain and the left brain. The left brain is very technical, detail-oriented. The right brain thinks in terms of a unified field, the connection between things. All the tests they do today on brain scans and CAT scans and the different parts of the brain, you'll see always consistently, the right brain is always connecting things. For example, with language, I just was reading as well, autistic children, they're doing tests on autistic children while they're asleep. They put them through a scanner to see, and they have a tape of a mother speaking to them. So autistic children, we know, have social disconnect. So their left brain works excellent, but their right brain does not spark up, which means that they're hearing words, but there's no connection between the words. Like the empathy that comes through language, they don't pick up on. They hear the words, they'll hear the instructions. These are the words that are being stated. But language is more than just words. Language is we're conveying feelings and love and sharing, which is, of course, not linear at all. It's very, very circular. So linear, of course, is square. Even in physics, for example, Newtonian physics, compared to Einstein physics, compared to quantum mechanics, is like square and circular. I'll give you an example. In Newtonian physics, and this was one of the big revolutions of the 20th century modern physics, everything became extremely regulated. Everything is rules. They call it the billiard ball effect. We may not know all the rules, but everything is absolutely structured. A billiard ball, every time you hit it one way, if it's always the same angle, it will always have the same reaction. Action, reaction. Cause and effect. And science became driven by the rules of cause and effect, which is itself was revelation, because up to that point they didn't even know the rules of nature in most cases. And this became the dominant. No one ever thought possible that science would ever change. It would only become more and more thorough in understanding the rules that make everything work. There was even a French thinker, I think his name was Laplace, who said the following in the end of the 19th century, or end of 19th century, that were you to give me, or to give a scientist, all the data on any given individual, I can tell you every decision they'll make till the end of time. The only problem is we don't have all the data. In other words, if we were able to map the genome, the DNA, and the genetic makeup of every human, of everything, I can tell you all the causes. Give me the causes and I'll tell you all the effects. Which of course created an uproar in the church and religious circles, because that basically no free will. We are just machines. So like a computer, just tell me everything the computer is made of, and you'll know everything this computer is capable of doing. And if you press this button, this will always happen. And this became a common thinking among scientists, that all that's lacking is lack of knowledge. That's the thing why we can't do it. We don't have all the data. But give me all the data, give us all the data, and we could figure it out. No one will say that today any longer, because quantum mechanics especially, theory of relativity as well, but especially quantum mechanics on a microscopic level, showed and demonstrated counterintuitively and against everyone's logic, and absolutely against Newtonian physics, and you'll see how it reconciles in a moment, that on a microscopic level, things are not at all structured in a linear fashion. There is no such thing as cause and effect. It's what they call a state of probability. It's a state of uncertainty. And on that level, there's no prediction. You can do the same thing twice and they'll have different results. Now, it makes no sense to us, right? Because we think of these terms. You put your hand in fire every time, God forbid, you'll be burned. I throw up a ball, it will fall every time. That's the rule. So how is it possible to think in those terms, but it's been proven again and again and again, that a light, for example, light can sometimes behave like a wave and sometimes like a particle. Or as Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, that a particle, a subatomic particle, you can never know both the velocity and its position at the same time. And when you measure it, you define it. And someone else measures it, it can be a different result. As bizarre as it sounds, this is not my own idea. These are documented again and again and now been proven. As a matter of fact, we would not have a microchip in such a small space and allowed to create so much power if it were not for the uncertainty principle. There was even a book a few years ago that said, how can you have a computer that is so certain based on an uncertainty principle? So no one really has an answer for that. But one thing we know for sure, that on the macroscopic level, Newton is correct. Things are absolutely predictable. On the microscopic level, it's not. And some way there's some communication between these two worlds, which still remains a mystery. The point I'm making here is that circular and linear or square thinking is everywhere. Is in science, is in philosophy, Western and Eastern. It's psychological, as I was discussing. And as I said, it goes back to the brackets here. So the Torah says, these two verses is about the journey of the Torah. So on one hand, you see a Torah with a structure, but you also see it traveling, which is the circle. And it's enclosed in a bracket, like the bracket within the circle, or a circle within the bracket. And as I said earlier, the free person is only the one that connects the Torah. So the Torah is saying that when we take the Torah scroll out of the ark, symbolically, and walk with it, you're really combining two worlds. A world of structure with a world of journey. I don't know if you know this, but the word for law in Judaism is called halacha. But halacha is a word for law, halacha. And you'd think, as I said before, the halacha is very rigid and limited in structure. But halacha has another meaning. You can pronounce it halicha. Al tikra halichis ela halachis is a statement where it says that a scholar or a sage or a tzaddik is always traveling. They're always a free spirit. They have no peace, not in this world and not in the world to come. Because they travel from generation to generation. I'm sorry, from level to level, dimension to dimension. And that same Talmud continues and says, Shenemer Yelchem Achayil Achayil, because it says you travel from strength to strength. And then it says an expression, Shenemer Halichas Eilam Loi, which means the movements of the universe are his. And answer, Al Tikra Halichas Ela Halachas, that a person who Kol Hashem Halachas B'Choyim, a person who studies halacha or immerses himself in halacha, travels. What's the connection? You could say the exact opposite. Someone that's connected to legalities and law is very square and very structured, and they don't travel anywhere. Because if they're not traveling, they only have what I said earlier, the dead weight without the wings. Halacha is not about rigid laws. It's about wings to fly to greater places. But you can't fly without structure. This world needs structure to transcend structure. which is the essential meaning of the fusing of the circle and the square. So in this verse here, we have Vayhi ben Soya ha'aron, which means the aron on one hand is a very defined structure. Aron is the ark. It has the Torah in it. The Torah has very strict guidelines, and it has le'pachas v'le'yeser. It's precise. Nothing extra and nothing missing. But then you say ben Soya, it's moving, it's traveling. The halacha and the halicha thing. When Mozart presented one of his, great masterpieces to the first time to the Archduke of Austria, so this great connoisseur of music, the Archduke, what he thought was a connoisseur, he said to Mozart, beautiful, but far too many notes. And Mozart allegedly or purportedly responded, yes, Your Majesty, but not one more than necessary. Far too many notes. So, as I said earlier with concealment and revealing, the balance of something, the fact that something is structured does not mean immediately that it's square. Structured can be very circular. It just means that it has a very clear awareness of its own parameters. The people who fly to the greatest places are the people who also know their limits. People who live in delusions may start flying, but they will end up falling pretty heavily. So the understanding of the structures of existence are not necessarily what limits us from flying to great places. In this case, in Mozart's music, which soars and bring many souls to soar, the music is very precise, not more and not less. Not more than necessary, not less than necessary. The Torah too makes statements like that. Le'pachas v'le'yeser is expression. Not more, not less. Or sometimes le'sesifim v'le'sigron. Don't add new mitzvahs and don't subtract. So if someone will say, listen, I want to add a 614th commandment. I'm a little more religious than everybody else. The answer is, don't be more religious than God. No one asked you. This structure is very precise. And to add is just like subtracting. There's an expression, kol hamesiv gareya. When you add to a situation that doesn't need to be added, it's just like you would diminish. So it's not like nothing lost. What do you care? There's a little extra piece. It's not that way. Think of it in terms of a microscopic term. Someone adds a little line of code, or just a dot in a code with millions and millions of lines of code and program code. That little dot changes it from working or not working. It's not just someone said, okay, what a big thing, I added something. Or God forbid, an extra chromosome or even an extra cell in the human body can wreak terrible havoc. So extra things sometimes are just as bad as missing something. So there's precision to the structures that we live in. The key thing is that these are structures that are not man-made and not imposed upon us. If someone will say, oh, I'm not a free spirit because I cannot go 7 days without eating and drinking, that doesn't mean you're not free. That means that you're crazy, basically. Because the structure of existence is that we human beings do have structure. There's a certain number you need to eat and sleep and drink and have other needs. That doesn't make you necessarily a limited human being. When you are aware of it and respect those boundaries and go by them, you can learn to soar places that you would never be able to soar to. So it's not just about defying and rebelling against structure. It's about using the structure to learn how to get beyond it. That's truly what's necessary. So if a person is hungry and thirsty and trying to defy mortality, they won't have the presence of mind and the ability to focus on being a free spirit. So all true freedom comes about working with what you have, not being trapped by it, not being imposed upon, and not letting human beings, of course, through peer pressure, impose it. Because that is the real trap. The things that trap us are not the structures, inherent structures in existence, or the inherent structures in the Torah. What traps us is how it was presented to us. If it's imposed upon you, and especially with fear and anger, and limits your ability to ask questions, and doesn't allow you to be yourself and be an individual, then you have halacha without halicha. Then you have rigidity, you have mechanics without a soul, a body without a soul. On the other hand, just free-spiritedness without structure is equally very elusive and not grounded. So in this world, it's really about combining these two, bin Soya ha'aron, taking two forces. One is very structured, and one travels, and one flies. And they can be combined. Unfortunately, we don't have communities and synagogues that really advocate this. You have two types. You have either those that talk a lot about flying, and there's no grounding going on, or you have others that talk a lot about grounding and there's no flying going on. So we definitely have the two, but they don't meet together. And I think maybe that's our mission here, the Meaningful Life Center, and with your assistance, is maybe to create a new grassroots community that can combine these two forces. It's quite challenging because it requires a real delicate balance between an individuality, at the same time balancing it with knowing that you're objective and you're not just doing it out of fear or out of your own excuses and comforts. You know, to fly takes courage, but it also takes courage to follow certain guidelines. So I don't think it has to be imposed by anyone, but it's important for us to recognize these two dimensions. And yes, those of us that can learn to master the square will learn to master how to be circles, and we have both elements within each of us. So practically speaking, can a circle and a square meet? Can they marry? Let's put it this way. Well, I would say they can, especially if each of them discovers the other within themselves, meaning the square discovers that there's a circle within him or her, and the circle discovers there's a square within him and her. But not square in the conventional sense I was discussing this evening. Obviously, we're talking about a more, I guess, sophisticated blend of these two, where they really come together, the garment and the circle. Now, I will continue this theme in the next weeks because it's a pretty intense one, and I obviously didn't exhaust or cover all the aspects of it, but I touched upon hopefully some key points that can help us all. Key is you have to challenge yourself. That's the bottom line. And without challenging yourself, you're not going anywhere. What can I say? I don't know. Now, I should have said that an hour and a half ago, and that's it. But I think it's more credible after this hour and a half to say. Now I have the credentials to be able to make that statement. So I want to say is that I hope that all of us can reveal deeper dimensions of our circles and squares within us, and most importantly, find others that can help us along the way. Like I said, you tide above, you don't fall below. We need to find people who can extract and help us build that courage, because it's going to take courage, because it's always fearful. Change is fearful, and especially when you think things are working for you, why rock the boat? But it could also be that you're trapped in your own comfort zone, and both the circle and square could help us, jolt us, catapult us to greater places. So I want to wish that upon all of us, and I can tell you, and I hope to discuss this a little more next week, that it's direct impact on how you will build your relationships in your life or not build them. Personal relationships, including finding your soulmate. So with that being said, on that happy note, on that nice note, let me make a few announcements. These are square and circle announcements all together, even though announcements themselves can be quite square-like. I remember I was once invited to speak somewhere, and I don't know why they chose this ridiculous-sounding topic. I mean, it wasn't ridiculous in a way, but this is what they called it. They called it, the non-existential nature of divine existence, something like that. I guess they wanted to attract some type of heady crowd. I'm not sure really. But the key thing that really struck me was when I was being introduced, so talking about Rabbi Jacobson, eloquent speaker, a writer, and all the accolades. And then when they finished the announcement introducing me, the guy says, "Well, before we have Rabbi Jacobson, I just want to make a brief announcement that people have been leaving their wet towels down in the gym, and we cannot deal with that any longer." Okay, here Rabbi Jacobson on the non-existential nature of divine existence. So it was a very interesting introduction. So what do you think I did? You have that book called Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. So I did basically the non-existential nature of the divine and wet towels in the synagogue. That was my thing. So it was quite a square introduction to a non-square topic, can you say? So this is what we have to deal with. With a little humor, you can handle it all. So as I said, I'll make some announcements, not about wet towels and not about stuff like that. But firstly, the class, I would like to say, is dedicated. This night's class in honor of our good friend's uncle, Mark Belinsky's uncle, Yankel ben Menachem Mendel, 14th of Sivan, and his parents' wedding anniversary on the 15th of Sivan, and his father's birthday on the 18th of Sivan. Okay, a lot of things, 14, 15, and 18. So that's Mark. And anyone wants to dedicate a class, it's a great honor to connect a class to either a loved one or a past soul. So please see me or Velvel. Velvel's the guy smiling right there, waving. He's a circular type. So that's that. Also, as I said before, if you haven't left your email address, please do that. We'll send you a circular message. I feel I have to apologize for every stupid announcement. But and then we will be here next week, next Wednesday night. I will be going tomorrow, for the record, in case any of you are interested, to Spain. So there's some flyers out in case you want to come to Spain. There are opportunities. I'm going to this thing called a European Jewish retreat. Pretty cool. I don't know myself what's happening there, but it looks good. So I'll be there. It's a place called, what's the name of the city? Marbella, Spain. Where is that? Has anyone been there? Is it nice? Okay, good. I'll be there. I'm also going to be speaking at a retreat. These are flyers outside, so you can feel free to just pick it up and check it out. If you want to pass it on to anyone, I'll be at a retreat in August. What's the date? The date is August 19th. So I'm making that announcement as well. All this, by the way, you can see in our calendar. We have a calendar of events. Now, very shortly, we're going to be announcing a series of programs that Velvel will be directing in charge of coming up for the next few months. New programs that we haven't done yet. So I'll give you a heads up about that, mostly in June. Since it's not final, I don't want to lock in the dates, but just keep your eyes open for them. This is one is going to be Kabbalah of Cooking series, a 4-part series. One is going to be on personalities, taking several personalities, Jewish Torah personalities, and explaining their lives and their relevance to us. Intriguing and somewhat controversial personalities as well. The third one, I'm going to be giving a webinar like I did on the Omer character development. I'm going to be doing something on 8 revolutionary principles that can change your life based on the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov, since now we are 250th anniversary of his yahrzeit. I'll be doing that. And we'll probably be having an interesting singles event here in late June, which again we'll announce. And finally, a film screening, right? So we're looking just finalizing the date. What's the name of the film? Do you remember? Anyway, bottom line is you all get the email. So we'll announce it. You'll have the information in detail. I just wanted to give you a heads up. And finally, tomorrow night, Philip will be here at 7 o'clock, as he is usually on Thursdays. And I will, as I said, be here next Wednesday. And if you have anyone to send regards to in Spain, here I am. You can tell me what you'd like to pass on. Sfard, which is in Hebrew the country called Spain. The Human Experience. Yes, I was interviewed on it. It's a very interesting film. Maya had shown her film here a few months ago, which was very well received. So they came to us, so we'll probably be screening that as well. And if anybody has ideas or programs or anything that you think is a good idea, we're pretty flexible and open to almost anything. I said almost because I've heard interesting ideas that the Meaningful Life Center can't yet embrace at this point. So with that being said, it was a pleasure talking to you about circles and squares. May have a very circular and square-like week, and a good fusion of the two. And it's an honor to be on to intersect on your spiritual journey. Thank you.